I don't understand, Serafina whispered, but the claws pressed deeper, and she felt warm blood trickle down her neck. Of course you don't, little lamb. Your kind never do, until it's too late. The werewolf's free hand gestured toward the fallen forms of its pack mates. But you will. When our master drains every drop of blood from your veins, he'll gain your power. The power to heal what should stay broken. Its voice dropped to a whisper that chilled her to the bone. The power to make vampires unstoppable. Lysander took a careful step forward, his movements slow and controlled. The prophecies are myths, old fears given form. She's just a kind human who saved an injured cat. But even as he spoke, Serafina could see the doubt in his eyes. The warmth in her chest was growing stronger, responding to her terror, and she could feel something awakening in her blood like fire spreading through kindling. The werewolf felt it too, its grip tightened, and it snarled low in its throat. Lies. Look at her, bloodsucker. Look at what's happening to her. Serafina looked down at her hands and gasped. Her skin was beginning to glow with soft, pearl light that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The light spread up her arms, and wherever it touched, she felt strong and alive in a way she'd never experienced. The werewolf's claws began to smoke where they touched her throat, and it howled in pain and rage. Impossible, it snarled, but its grip was loosening. You're human. You can't be, the words cut off as the light flared brighter, and suddenly the creature was stumbling backward, its flesh burning wherever her light had touched. Now, Lysander commanded, and he moved faster than her eyes could follow. There was a flash of silver, the sound of steel meeting bone, and then silence. The werewolf collapsed, its yellow eyes fading to brown as death claimed it. Lysander was beside her instantly, his cold hands gentle on her face as he examined the claw marks on her throat. Are you hurt? Can you hear me? But Serafina was staring at her hands in wonder and terror. The light was fading, but she could still feel it humming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. What's happening to me? She whispered. Lysander's expression was grave. I believe, dear one, that you're becoming something the world hasn't seen for 1,000 years. Chapter 5, The Awakening. Lysander helped Serafina to her feet, his touch careful and reverent. The apartment was destroyed, furniture overturned, walls slashed by claws, windows shattered by the force of supernatural combat. But all she could focus on was the strange energy still coursing through her veins, making every nerve ending sing with power she didn't understand. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, like lightning captured in her bloodstream. Every breath she took seemed to pull more energy from the air around her, and she could feel something fundamental shifting in the fabric of her being. We need to leave, Lysander said urgently, but his voice sounded distant, muffled by the roaring in her ears. More will come, and not all of them will be as crude as these. He gestured toward the fallen werewolves, but Serafina was drawn to move closer to them. The power in her chest was pulling her forward with an irresistible magnetism, as if recognizing something in the still forms that her conscious mind couldn't grasp. Against all logic, she knelt beside the nearest body, her hands hovering inches above the creature's chest. The werewolf's fur was matted with blood, its breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible, but underneath the surface she could sense something else, a spark of life that hadn't quite been extinguished, a soul trapped between human and beast that was crying out for release. The energy in her veins responded to that cry with a surge so powerful it made her gasp. Don't, Lysander warned, but it was too late. The moment her fingers touched the werewolf's fur, light blazed from her hands again, but this time it was different. Instead of the soft pearl radiance from before, this light was silver white and blindingly intense, shot through with veins of deep crimson that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The creature's eyes snapped open, yellow fading to human brown, its wolf features melting back into the face of a young man barely older than herself. He gasped, struggling to breathe, and looked up at her with wonder and terror etched across his suddenly human features. You're the Lightbringer, he whispered, his voice hoarse with awe. The legends were true. Before either she or Lysander could react, the man dissolved into smoke and shadow, vanishing like a bad dream. Only the scent of pine forests and wild places remained, along with something else, a metallic tang that reminded her of old coins and winter nights. What just happened? Serafina demanded, rounding on Lysander as the light faded from her hands. What did I do to him? But even as she asked, she could feel the answer settling into her bones with uncomfortable certainty. She hadn't just healed the werewolf, she had fundamentally changed him, rewritten the very essence of what he was. The vampire's face was pale even by his standards, his silver eyes wide with something between awe and fear that bordered on terror. His immortal composure had cracked, revealing an uncertainty that made her stomach clench with dread. You healed him, he said slowly, each word carefully measured as if he were afraid they might shatter something fragile. Not just his wounds, you healed the curse that bound him to wolf form. In 800 years of existence, I have never seen such a thing. He ran his hands through his dark hair, a gesture so human it made her heart ache with its vulnerability. The werewolf spoke truly. You are the lightbringer of the old prophecies, the one who can heal the ancient divisions between our kinds. But there was something else in his expression now, a dawning recognition that seemed to frighten him more than any werewolf attack ever could. His silver eyes were fixed on her hands where traces of that crimson-veined light still flickered beneath her skin, and she could see him putting together pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed. But that light, he whispered, more to himself than to her. That signature, those crimson threads, it's impossible. It can't be. I don't want to be any kind of bringer, Serafina said, panic rising in her throat as she backed away from both him and the spot where the werewolf had vanished. I just want to be normal. I want to pay my rent and find a job and maybe have a quiet life where strange men don't break down my door. But even as she spoke, she could feel the power settling into her bones like it belonged there, like it had always been there waiting for the right moment to awaken. It felt right in a way that nothing in her life ever had, as if she'd been walking around incomplete her entire existence and only now realized what was missing. The sensation was overwhelming, like remembering a dream that had felt more real than waking life. Lysander stepped closer, his expression shifting from fear to something that looked almost like guilt. I'm afraid normal is no longer an option, dear one. Too many people know what you are now. But his voice carried an undertone she couldn't identify, a weight that suggested there were layers to this conversation she wasn't seeing. Serafina, he said carefully, that light you just produced, it carries a specific magical signature. One that I recognize. The admission seemed to cost him something, and she could see his hands trembling slightly as he reached toward her. I need you to trust me for a moment. I need to examine the energy more closely. What aren't you telling me? She demanded, instinctively stepping back from his outstretched hand. The power in her chest was responding to her emotional state, growing brighter and more agitated with each passing second. You know something about this, about what's happening to me. I can see it in your face. Lysander's jaw tightened, and for a moment she glimpsed the true age behind his youthful appearance, centuries of secrets and difficult choices etched into his immortal features. Please, he said quietly. Let me touch your hand. Let me confirm what I pray is not true. Against her better judgment, Serafina extended her palm toward him. The moment his cold fingers made contact with her skin, the crimson threads in her light flared brighter, and she felt a jolt of recognition pass between them, not her recognition, but his power recognizing something familiar in hers. Lysander jerked his hand back as if he'd been burned, his face going ashen. Impossible, he breathed, staring at her with eyes wide with horror and something that might have been grief. It can't be. You can't be. His voice cracked on the words, and she realized with shock that this ancient, powerful creature was on the verge of breaking down completely. Can't be what? She pressed, though part of her was afraid of the answer. The power in her chest was resonating with whatever had just passed between them, growing stronger and more complex by the moment. She could feel new abilities awakening, new connections forming between her consciousness and the supernatural world around her. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, like discovering she could fly while standing at the edge of a cliff. Lysander, you're scaring me. What did you see when you touched me? For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his ancient mind clearly racing through possibilities and implications she couldn't begin to imagine. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 20 years ago, he said slowly, I was passing through this city on business. There was a fire at a foster home on the east side. You probably don't remember it clearly, traumatic memories often blur, but I was drawn to the scene by something I couldn't identify at the time. His silver eyes met hers, and she could see pain there that went deeper than physical injury. I arrived too late to prevent the tragedy, but I sensed something impossible, a pure soul departing, a light unlike anything I'd encountered in 8 centuries of existence. The words hit her like ice water, dragging up memories she'd buried so deeply she'd almost convinced herself they were nightmares. The smell of smoke, the sound of sirens, the sensation of floating above her own body while chaos erupted below. The fire, she whispered, her hand moving unconsciously to her chest where a small scar had always marked her skin, a scar she'd been told came from falling debris. I remember watching everything from above, like I was flying. But that's impossible. I survived that fire. I'm here. You died in that fire, Lysander said gently, each word falling like a stone into still water. I felt your soul leave your body, saw it beginning its journey to whatever comes after this existence. But something about your light, your pure essence, called to me in a way I'd never experienced before. In that moment, faced with the loss of something so beautiful and rare, I made a choice that has haunted me ever since. His voice broke, and she could see tears gathering in his immortal eyes. I bound part of my essence to your departing soul and pulled you back. I gave you a piece of my immortality, my power, my very being to keep you anchored to this world. The revelation shattered her understanding of everything she thought she knew about herself. That's impossible, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, pieces were clicking into place with horrible clarity. The way she'd always felt different from other humans, the inexplicable connection she'd felt to Lysander from the moment they met, the reason her power carried that familiar crimson signature, it was his power, or at least a piece of it, transformed by its union with her human soul. You're saying I've been dead for 20 years? That everything I am, everything I've experienced, has been some kind of supernatural life support? Not life support, Lysander said urgently, stepping closer despite her obvious distress. You're not some puppet animated by my power. What you became is something entirely new, something that has never existed before in all the long history of the supernatural world. You are human soul bonded with vampire essence, mortal compassion enhanced by immortal strength. You are yourself, Seraphina, but you are also more than you ever imagined possible. His hands hovered near hers, wanting to comfort but afraid to make contact again. Your Lightbringer abilities aren't some prophetic gift, they're the result of that unique fusion, the power to heal and transform because you yourself are healed and transformed. A soft meow from the window made them both turn, providing a momentary respite from the overwhelming revelation. Shadowmere sat on the sill, looking perfectly healthy and sleek, his emerald eyes bright with intelligence that seemed almost human. But when he leaped down to approach Seraphina, she could see something different about him too, something that now made perfect sense in light of what she'd just learned. His black fur now held threads of silver that caught the light like starshine, and when he brushed against her legs, she felt a warm connection snap into place, a bond deeper than friendship, deeper than pet and owner. It was the same type of connection she could now feel thrumming between herself and Lysander, the recognition of shared essence. He's changed too, she breathed, kneeling to stroke Shadowmere's transformed fur. The cat purred with that too deep rumble, and she could feel his contentment at being reunited with both her and his master. He recognizes the bond now, doesn't he? He knew what I was before I did. Lysander nodded, his expression still heavy with guilt and ancient sorrow. Shadowmere has been my familiar for 3 centuries. He can sense my essence anywhere in the world, which is why he was drawn to you long before we formally met. Your power doesn't just heal, it transforms, because transformation is what saved you, what made you possible in the first place. The implications were staggering, reshaping everything she thought she understood about her life and purpose. So when I healed the werewolf, when I freed him from his curse, I was doing what you did for me 20 years ago. The parallel was both beautiful and terrifying, suggesting that her greatest power came from her greatest trauma. And now that it's awakened, every supernatural creature for 1,000 miles will sense it because they'll recognize your signature mixed with something they've never encountered before. Yes, Lysander said simply. They'll come for you, Seraphina. All of them. Some will want to worship you as the prophesied Lightbringer, others will want to study you to understand how such a fusion is possible, and still others will want to destroy you because you represent a fundamental challenge to the established order of supernatural society. His silver eyes blazed with protective fury. But they'll have to go through me first, because you are mine in ways that go deeper than any bond they could possibly understand. You carry part of my soul, my essence, my immortal life force. Protecting you isn't just duty or desire, it's survival. The weight of that revelation settled over her like a mantle, heavy with responsibility and possibility in equal measure. So what does this mean for us? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. What does this mean for what we're becoming? The connection between them hummed with new awareness, no longer the attraction between strangers but the recognition of two beings who shared something fundamental and unbreakable. It was intimate beyond anything she'd ever experienced, deeper than love, more essential than friendship. It means, Lysander said softly, that we are bound together in ways that transcend normal relationships. You are not just under my protection, you are part of me, as I am part of you. It means that what I feel for you goes beyond attraction or affection into something that has no name in any human language. His voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to resonate in her bones. It means that loving you is loving the best part of myself, and losing you would be a death more final than any stake through the heart. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night air, growing steadily louder. We need to leave, Lysander said, his protective instincts overriding the emotional intensity of their revelation. The authorities will want answers we cannot provide, and there will be supernatural investigators mixed in with the human ones. Now that your power has fully awakened, now that you understand what you are, staying here is no longer an option. He moved toward the shattered window, gesturing for her to follow. Are you ready to leave this life behind? Are you ready to embrace what you've always been, even if you didn't know it? Seraphina looked around the ruined apartment one last time, seeing it now not as the loss of safety but as the end of a lie she'd been living unknowingly. The terrified girl who had cleaned office buildings and eaten ramen noodles was gone, transformed as completely as the werewolf she'd healed. In her place stood something new, not human, not vampire, but a bridge between worlds that carried the potential to heal ancient wounds or tear them wider than ever before. I'm ready, she said, and meant it. But Lysander, if I carry part of your essence, if we're bound together at the level of souls, then what happens if one of us dies? What happens to the connection? His smile was sad and ancient, carrying the weight of 8 centuries of existence. Then we find out together, he said simply. Because after tonight, after what we've discovered, there is no scenario in which we face the future apart. He held out his hand, and when she took it, she felt the full force of their connection blazing to life, vampire and human who was more than human, bound by essence and choice and something deeper than fate. Come, my dear one. Let's see what tomorrow brings to the Lightbringer and her ancient guardian. As they prepared to leave through the window, Shadowmere winding around their feet with obvious satisfaction, Seraphina felt a strange sense of completion settle over her. For the first time in her life, her first life and her second, she knew exactly who and what she was. The knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but it was hers. She was no longer drifting through existence wondering why nothing felt quite right. She was Seraphina, the girl who had died in fire and been reborn in darkness, carrying light that could heal the divisions between worlds. And she was ready to discover just how bright that light could burn. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Lysander moved to the shattered window, his enhanced senses scanning the night. Police, fire department, probably some government agents who monitor supernatural incidents, he said grimly. We have perhaps 5 minutes before this place is swarming with people who will ask questions we cannot answer. He turned back to Seraphina, his silver eyes intense. I can protect you, but only if you trust me completely. I can take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can learn to control your power before it consumes you. But you must choose now. Seraphina looked around at the destruction that had been her sanctuary, meager as it was. Every stick of furniture she'd carefully collected was ruined, every small comfort destroyed. But worse than the material loss was the knowledge that she could never go back to the simple life she'd fought so hard to build. The power humming in her blood wouldn't let her hide anymore. What about Marcus? She asked. He'll keep looking for me, and now there are werewolves and who knows what else. The question hung between them like a blade. Marcus, Lysander said carefully, is no longer your greatest concern. The supernatural world has awakened to your existence, and that changes everything. Some will want to worship you, others to use you, still others to destroy you before you can upset the balance of power that has existed for millennia. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. But I swear to you, by blood and shadow and the ancient codes that bind my kind, no harm will come to you while I draw breath. I offer you my protection, my resources, my immortal life in service of keeping you safe. The sirens were louder now, maybe 2 blocks away. Seraphina felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a cloak she'd never asked to wear. But when she looked at Lysander, really looked, she saw not just a predator offering protection, but something else. In his silver eyes, she glimpsed centuries of loneliness, of watching the world change while remaining forever apart from it. He needed her as much as she needed him, though for different reasons. If I go with you, she said slowly, what happens to the person I was before tonight? She evolves, Lysander said simply. She becomes who she was always meant to be. Shadowmere twined around her ankles, purring with that too deep rumble, and Seraphina felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. Outside, car doors slammed and heavy footsteps echoed in the stairwell. She looked one last time at the ruins of her small life, then turned to face whatever came next. Okay, she whispered. I trust you. Lysander's smile was radiant, transforming his aristocratic features into something beautiful and almost human. He swept his coat around her shoulders and lifted her into his arms. Then we fly. Chapter 6, Into the Darkness. Lysander carried Seraphina through the shattered window and into the storm, but instead of falling, they soared. The city spread below them like a circuit board of light and shadow, and the wind whipped her hair across her face as they rose above the buildings. She should have been terrified, but instead, she felt free for the first time in her life, or what she now understood to be her second life. The revelation of her death and resurrection still hummed in her bones, making every sensation more vivid, every moment more precious. Behind them, the apartment building erupted in blue and red lights as emergency vehicles surrounded it, but they were already beyond reach, beyond questions, beyond the mundane world that had never quite fit her anyway. Flying felt natural, as if the part of her that was bound to Lysander's immortal essence remembered what it was like to transcend human limitations. They landed on the roof of a gleaming skyscraper that pierced the night sky like a silver needle. Lysander set her down gently, his hands lingering on her waist longer than necessary, and she could feel the connection between them thrumming with new intensity now that she understood its true nature. Welcome to my home, he said, gesturing toward a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see rooms that belonged in a museum, antique furniture, priceless art, shelves lined with books that looked older than countries. The opulence was staggering, speaking of wealth accumulated over centuries, but there was something else about the space that made her skin prickle with unease. The shadows seemed too deep, too purposeful, as if they were hiding secrets she wasn't meant to discover. "You'll be safe here," Lysander continued, his voice carrying that hypnotic quality she'd first noticed in her hallway. "The building is warded against supernatural intrusion, and my associates will ensure no one reaches you." The way he said associates made her wonder exactly what kind of being served an 800-year-old vampire, and whether their loyalty was born of affection or fear. The penthouse was beautiful, but it felt like a golden cage, luxurious, comfortable, and completely isolated from the outside world. For someone who had just discovered she was bound to him at the level of souls, the prospect of being locked away in his tower felt both protective and suffocating. Shadowmere materialized beside them, apparently having made his own way to the rooftop through means she couldn't fathom. In the cleaner air above the city, Serafina could see that his transformation was even more dramatic than she'd realized. The silver threads in his fur formed intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them, and his emerald eyes now held flecks of the same pearl light that had blazed from her hands. But there was something else about his appearance that troubled her. The patterns in his fur looked almost like writing, like symbols from a language she didn't recognize, but that felt familiar in an uncomfortable way. "He's beautiful," she whispered, kneeling to stroke Shadowmere's transformed coat. The cat purred, but the sound carried undertones that reminded her of distant thunder or the rumble of some great machine. Lysander's expression softened as he watched them interact, but there was something calculating in his silver eyes that hadn't been there before. "He was already beautiful," he said quietly. "You simply revealed his true nature." The words carried weight she was beginning to understand. Everything about her situation, from her rescue of the cat to her awakening power, felt orchestrated rather than coincidental. The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind whipping across the rooftop. As they moved toward the penthouse entrance, Serafina felt a presence watching them from the shadows. Not the warm attention she'd grown accustomed to from Lysander, but something cold and predatory that made every instinct scream danger. She turned, scanning the rooftops of nearby buildings, her newly awakened senses picking up movements and energies that her human vision couldn't quite process. The feeling persisted, multiple sets of eyes focused on her with laser intensity, studying her like a specimen in a laboratory. "Someone's out there," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Multiple someones. They're watching us." Lysander stiffened, his entire demeanor shifting from protective lover to apex predator in the space of a heartbeat. His senses swept the surrounding buildings with supernatural intensity, and she could feel his power rising like heat from a forge. "Where?" he demanded, but before she could answer, a figure stepped from behind an air conditioning unit on the neighboring building. Even at a distance, she could see the yellow glow of its eyes and the way it moved with inhuman grace. But there was something different about this werewolf, older, more controlled, carrying itself with the authority of leadership rather than the desperation of a hunter. "We have a problem," Lysander said grimly, but his tone carried undertones she'd never heard before, not just concern, but something that might have been fear. The werewolf raised something to its mouth, a horn carved from what looked like bone, and blew a long, mournful note that echoed across the cityscape. The sound was haunting, beautiful, and utterly alien, carrying harmonics that spoke of ancient magic and older loyalties. Within moments, answering calls rose from a dozen different directions, surrounding them with a symphony of howls that spoke not of mindless aggression but of coordinated purpose. "They're calling in reinforcements," Serafina realized, the power in her blood responding to the perceived threat with a warm surge that felt different than before, less like healing energy and more like a weapon preparing to discharge. "How many?" The question came out steadier than she felt, but she could sense Lysander's approval at her composure. His smile was sharp and predatory, but there was something brittle about it, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. "Enough to make this interesting," he said. "But they've made one crucial mistake." He turned to face her, his silver eyes blazing with ancient fury that seemed to burn colder than ice. "They've threatened what belongs to me." The possessiveness in his voice should have been reassuring, but instead it sent warning bells clanging in her mind. The way he said, "belongs to me," carried implications that went beyond protection or even love. It was the voice of someone claiming property, asserting ownership over something valuable. The first werewolf leaped the gap between buildings with impossible grace, landing on their rooftop with barely a sound. As it straightened to its full height, Serafina saw it was larger than the ones from her apartment, older, more powerful, with scars that spoke of countless battles survived and wisdom earned through conflict. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority of an alpha, but also something else, desperation tinged with hope, as if this confrontation was their last chance at something vital. Lightbringer, it rumbled, you will come with us willingly, or we will take you in pieces. The choice is yours. The words should have been threatening, but there was something in the creature's tone that suggested rescue rather than kidnapping. Shadowmere hissed, his fur standing on end, and Serafina felt her power flare in response to the perceived threat. But before she could answer, the werewolf's eyes widened with shock, staring at something behind her. Impossible, it breathed, its voice cracking with what sounded like recognition and horror combined. The Council of Shadows said you were all dead. Serafina turned and gasped. Lysander was no longer alone. 6 figures in dark clothing had materialized around them as if they'd stepped out of the shadows themselves. They moved with the same inhuman grace as Lysander, but there was something different about their presence, colder, more ancient, carrying an authority that made even her powerful protector seem young by comparison. Their eyes glowed with the same silver fire as Lysander's, but the light was sharper, more focused, like surgical instruments designed for precision cutting. Not dead, Lysander said quietly, his voice carrying across the rooftop like a promise of violence. Just sleeping. But awakening the Lightbringer has awakened us as well. His tone held layers of meaning that made Serafina's newly enhanced senses prickle with unease. And we do not appreciate being disturbed. The way he spoke suggested these weren't his allies arriving to help, but something else entirely, rivals, perhaps, or judges arriving to pass sentence. The air around them crackled with supernatural tension, and she could feel multiple powers pressing against each other like storm fronts colliding. The lead figure among the newcomers stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a face that was both beautiful and terrible, ageless features carved from marble, eyes that held the weight of millennia, and an expression of such profound sadness that it made her chest ache. When he spoke, his voice carried accents from a dozen dead languages. Lysander Nightfall, he said, and the names seemed to echo with additional syllables that hurt to hear. The Council of Shadows greets you after far too long an absence. His gaze shifted to Serafina, and she felt examined by something infinitely old and patient. And we greet the Lightbringer, though we had hoped to meet her under different circumstances. You have no business here, Aurelius, Lysander replied, but there was something strained in his voice that Serafina had never heard before, not fear, exactly, but the sound of someone whose careful plans were beginning to unravel. The girl is under my protection. She has awakened to her true nature and chosen to stand with me. Your interference is neither wanted nor needed. His protective stance shifted subtly, and she realized he was positioning himself not just to defend her from the werewolves, but to keep her away from these newcomers as well. Aurelius smiled, and the expression was both kind and heartbreaking. Chosen, he repeated gently. Dear Lysander, does she know what she's choosing? Does she understand what you truly are, what you've been planning for her since the moment you bound your essence to her dying soul? The words hit Serafina like ice water, reframing everything she thought she understood about her relationship with Lysander. Does she know that the Lightbringer prophecy isn't about healing supernatural divisions, but about creating a vessel powerful enough to contain your true form? Lies, Lysander snarled, but his denial came too quickly, too desperately. They seek to turn you against me, dear one. They've hunted my kind for millennia, destroying everything beautiful and powerful in their path. But even as he spoke, Serafina could feel something shifting in the connection between them. Not the warm bond of shared essence, but something else, something that felt like chains wrapping around her soul. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, and she realized with growing horror that it had been there all along, hidden beneath the more obvious magical connection. The werewolf alpha took a step closer, its yellow eyes fixed on her face with desperate intensity. Lightbringer, listen to me. We are not your enemies. We've been trying to reach you, to warn you, before he could complete the bonding process. Its voice carried conviction that rang true in her bones. Lysander isn't just any vampire, he's the source, the original darkness from which all vampiric curses spring. For 3,000 years, he's moved through history, manipulating conflicts, creating supernatural divisions to maintain his power. The binding he performed on you 20 years ago wasn't mercy, it was preparation. Preparation for what? Serafina demanded, though part of her already suspected the answer. The power in her chest was responding to her emotional turmoil, growing brighter and more chaotic with each revelation. She could feel Lysander's influence pressing against her mind, trying to soothe her fears, but now that she was aware of it, his mental touch felt invasive rather than comforting. What was he preparing me for? Aurelius stepped closer, his ancient eyes full of compassion. Possession, child. When your power reaches its full potential, and it's very close now, he plans to subsume your consciousness entirely, to use your body as a vessel for his true form. The Lightbringer abilities aren't meant to heal supernatural divisions, they're meant to remake the supernatural world in his image, with him as its immortal god-king. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of understanding through everything she thought she knew about her situation. Think about it, the werewolf added urgently. How convenient that you found his familiar injured right outside your building. How perfectly timed that he appeared just as you were in danger. How naturally you trusted him despite every instinct telling you that strange men during storms are dangerous. Each point hit home with devastating accuracy, painting a picture of manipulation so subtle and long-term that she felt sick at her own naivety. He's been watching you, guiding your life, ensuring you remained isolated and vulnerable until the moment he needed you to awaken. Lysander's beautiful face contorted with fury, his careful mask finally slipping to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. Enough, he roared, and his voice carried harmonics that made the building shake. She is mine by right of creation, by blood and essence and 20 years of careful cultivation. You cannot simply walk in here and steal her away with your poisonous lies. His silver eyes blazed with power that no longer felt protective, and Serafina could see his true nature finally showing through, not the romantic protector she'd fallen for, but something infinitely old and utterly ruthless. Is it true? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything they're saying, is it true? The power in her chest was responding to her emotional state, growing brighter and more unstable with each passing second. She could feel the bond between them stretching, changing, as her understanding of its nature shifted from blessing to curse. Did you orchestrate everything? My rescue of Shadowmere, the werewolf attacks, even finding me in the first place? For a moment, Lysander's expression softened back into the gentle mask she'd grown to love. Serafina, dear one, you must understand, everything I've done has been to protect you, to help you reach your full potential. Yes, I guided certain events, but only to ensure your safety, to make sure you awakened in the right circumstances. His voice carried that hypnotic quality again, but now she could hear the compulsion woven through it, the supernatural influence trying to override her rational mind. We are bonded at the level of souls. What I want and what's best for you are the same thing. No, she said firmly, the word blazing with power that made the air around them shimmer. What you want is control. What you want is a body to possess and power to steal. The truth of it settled into her bones with absolute certainty, and she felt something fundamental shift in the magical connection between them. Instead of flowing toward him, her power began to pull inward, consolidating and strengthening as she reclaimed pieces of herself she hadn't realized were missing. Aurelius smiled with what looked like relief. She sees clearly now, old friend. The game is over. He gestured to his companions, who moved to form a protective circle around Serafina. The Council of Shadows has been hunting you for 3 millennia, Lysander. You've evaded us by moving frequently, by never staying in one form or one identity long enough for us to track you down. But this time, your greed has betrayed you. Your need for the perfect vessel has kept you in one place, one identity, long enough for us to find you. The werewolf alpha's form began to shift, becoming more human with each passing second. When the transformation was complete, she saw a man in his 30s with kind eyes and scars that spoke of battles fought for noble causes. My pack has been watching over you for months, Lightbringer, trying to find a way to warn you without triggering his protective instincts. We knew that direct confrontation would only drive him to accelerate his plans. His voice was warm, human, completely different from the threatening growl she'd expected. Everything we did, including the attack on his familiar, was designed to force him to reveal himself before he was ready. You injured Shadowmere deliberately, Seraphina realized, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. You knew I would save him, knew it would awaken my power and force Lysander to approach me directly. The manipulation went deeper than she'd imagined, with multiple factions moving pieces on a board she hadn't even known existed. The cat in question materialized beside her, his emerald eyes now clearly apologetic as he wound around her ankles with obvious regret. Shadowmere has been our ally for decades, Aurelius explained gently. Bound to Lysander by ancient magic, but not by choice. The injury was carefully calculated, painful enough to require healing, minor enough to avoid permanent damage. He volunteered for the deception because he knew it was the only way to save both of you from what Lysander had planned. The revelation reframed everything she thought she understood about the cat's rescue, but somehow it felt more honest than anything Lysander had told her. Lysander's laughter was cold and sharp as winter wind. How touching. A conspiracy of the righteous, all working together to save the poor, deluded human from the evil vampire. His form began to change, growing taller and more terrible with each passing second. But you've made one crucial error in your calculations, my dear enemies. The bonding process is already complete. Seraphina's power is mine to command, her body mine to inhabit, her soul mine to consume. His voice deepened, carrying harmonics that spoke of power accumulated over millennia. Did you really think I would wait 20 years and then leave anything to chance? Pain flared through Seraphina's chest as she felt something invasive pressing against her consciousness, not the gentle touch she'd grown accustomed to, but a brutal mental assault designed to overwhelm her defenses and claim her mind entirely. The power in her blood responded with blazing fury, pushing back against the invasion with strength she didn't know she possessed. No, she snarled, her voice carrying harmonics of its own. You don't get to have me. Not my power, not my body, not my soul. I choose who I am, and I choose who I belong to. The battle for her mind intensified, but she wasn't fighting alone. She could feel the council's power supporting her, lending her strength and knowledge accumulated over centuries of hunting creatures like Lysander. The werewolf pack added their own energy to hers, wild and free and utterly opposed to the chains he was trying to forge around her consciousness. Even Shadowmere contributed, his familiar magic helping to sever the bonds that had held him to his unwilling master for so long. Impossible, Lysander gasped, his beautiful features contorting with rage and disbelief. You're human. Enhanced, yes, but still mortal. You cannot resist 3,000 years of accumulated power. But even as he spoke, she could see doubt creeping into his ancient eyes. The careful plans of millennia were crumbling around him, brought down by the one thing he'd never truly understood, the power of choice freely given rather than taken by force. I'm not just human, Seraphina said, her voice ringing with newfound certainty. I'm something new, something you helped create but could never truly control. I am the bridge between worlds, the healing force you tried to corrupt for your own ends. The power blazed brighter in her chest, burning away the last of his invasive influence. And I choose to stand with those who fight for freedom rather than those who seek to enslave. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Seraphina felt a fundamental shift in the supernatural landscape around them. The ancient evil that had masqueraded as her protector was finally revealed, but so was her own true strength. She was no longer the frightened girl who cleaned office buildings and ate ramen noodles. She was the light bringer, and her real work was just beginning.